All right, so I might link these next few stories together since they're all kind of talking about the housing bubble that we might very well might be in right now. That's sort of itching to be popped at the exact same time that I'm sort of soft predicting that there's a recession going on or there's a recession that might about to be kicking off. This would align perfectly well with that. The housing bubble. Over 1 million homeowners have negative equity. Downward spiral looms. Here's the quick summary points. The U.S. housing market reached unprecedented bubble levels in 2025, now showing early signs of price weakness and declining affordability. Home affordability has deteriorated sharply, with the Home Affordability Index at 80, well below the threshold for sustainable demand. Mortgage rates remain elevated above 6%, with limited prospects for significant declines, further pressuring housing demand and prices. Surging negative equity, rising foreclosures, and job market weakness suggest a growing risk for a downward spiral in home prices. And for those not familiar, when home prices have a huge drop off, that is almost the definition of a recession because so much of the US economy is tied up in home prices. To sort of oversimplify this complex thing. In late 2025, the housing outlook showed some signs of hope. In December, President Trump said he planned to introduce the most aggressive housing reform plan in history, which was expected to include policies such as lower mortgage rates, less regulation for home builders, oh baby, and increased limits for FHA loans. The Trump administration also discussed the possibility of creating portable mortgages and allowing homeowners to withdraw funds from their 401ks for a down payment. All of that is a terrible, I don't know about all of that, but specifically what catches my eye as terrible ideas is less regulation from home builders. Yeah, it's a big shocker that the guy who spent his entire career as like a real estate mogul construction type guy who consistently there's old Senate hearings from like the 80s where in 90s where he's Trump's up there talking to Congress about why asbestos is so good and should be allowed in these building materials and allowed in the construction of buildings, despite its connections to negative and adverse health effects, right? So it's not surprising at all that he just basically doesn't really, he sees housing and building regulations as more of a burden rather than an important part of our modern society. And also directly connected to that is that, what is it? Something like 1/4 or a huge percentage of homes built in the U.S. nowadays are built by these handful of major giga construction firms, right? I don't know the names of them off the top of my head. Maybe I'll list them on the screen right now. But I literally just watched a documentary special like a few days ago about how this one of these handful of big players is known for making really low quality homes that fall apart, that are subject to mold in a way that, higher quality built homes aren't, right? And this documentary talked about its connection to the consolidation of the construction market and how these companies aren't really competing against each other so much. They have connections to land hoarding and restricting the availability of land in certain areas for other smaller construction firms to potentially buy up and build apartment blocks, to build single family homes in. And so I can't help but think about that at the same time. They're saying, yeah, we can allow even less regulations. These mega home construction firms that are building a huge percentage of the new homes being created over the last few years and likely will over the next few years in the United States are already cutting as many corners as they possibly can to not create the best homes that they can for the people, right? They're not in a market that's properly competitive where they're trying to compete against other firms to build the best, most high quality homes, in order to attract customers. They're doing the exact opposite. They're trying to cut corners as much as they possibly can to raise their short-term stock valuation and whatnot. And basically trying to screw people over, trying to trick people into paying for and get into mortgages that are too high for them and to buy homes that are too low quality and that are more expensive than they should be. I'm pretty sure there's literally a RICO case against one of these major home companies because of their deceptive practices regarding how they frame mortgages and home payments for new home buyers. So this seems like a terrible idea, right? I mean, I also just can't help but think of that apartment complex that collapsed in Florida a few years ago, right? Killing hundreds of people inside, right? These regulations are, home building regulations and are so important because what are you going to, you can't expect every individual person to be an expert on the integrity of a home or the safety of a home. Does, being able to identify if a wall has asbestos in it or something, right? We, we live in a modern society where people have, are segmented, right? Typically people's jobs are limited to one or a handful of tasks, right? If you're a software developer, right, you spend 40, 50 hours of your week every week of your entire life developing software, right? Not learning building codes or how to construct a home or where it is or isn't possibly safe to put asbestos or lead or things like that, right? You rely on living in a modern society that you contribute into to take care of you in that regard, to ensure that, okay, if I go and purchase a house with that money that I worked hard for, that I provided utility to the society provides me some money or whatever, that you have some level of trust, some level of security in knowing that the house is not, the apartment complex you're moving into is not going to collapse on you or whatever, right? And the other thing that catches my eye is allowing homeowners to withdraw funds from their 401k accounts for a down payment. Now, in a purely, I can understand why on a surface level some people might be in favor of this from a like pure freedom, liberty type perspective, right? Maybe they would argue something along the lines of, oh, well, that's my money anyways. I paid into that 401k, right? So I should be able to do what I want with it. Well, in an isolated theoretical sense, I would agree. But in practice, what does that lead to, right? Well, I can only imagine this leading to at least some percentage of people who do this becoming destitute because of it, right? They maybe don't make the best decision in the home they're buying. They kind of get screwed in the mortgage. They get screwed in the price. They get screwed in whatever. They get screwed by the market, right? Maybe they buy at market rate, but then the market collapses 6 months after they buy the home, and it takes many, many years to recover, or maybe it never recovers to the point where it was. And in those cases, right, pulling out of their 401k is going to only screw themselves later on down the future, right? Taking care of our elderly is extremely important. That's the whole reason we have Social Security, right? When you're older, your ability to provide utility to the society and your ability to personally generate revenue and through a job, through a business or whatever is necessarily reduced, right? And so it's important that we have a system that actually takes care of people and acknowledges that people are not perfect actors, that they may not always truly know what's best for them in the long term. And so having small restrictions like this, like saying you're not allowed to pull from your 401k for a down payment on a new home that you want to buy when you're 40s or something, makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And so that seems very scary to me. That could lead to many people becoming sort of screwed over and destitute. And who benefits in that scenario, right? It's going to be these scummy construction firms, these scummy home whatever, these home selling firms that are going to be the ones to benefit off this at the expense of some people being destitute when they're 80 years old and not being able to afford their medical bills or not being able to afford a dignified retirement or a dignified life at that point, despite having provided more than sufficient utility, despite having done their part all throughout their life and done the right thing, worked hard, contributed to society, right? Those people are owed a dignified elderly life. They are owed it literally by society, and having just screwy nonsense like this that can just bureaucratic BS, just money silliness that can screw them over, is in part their fault, but I think it's more society's fault for allowing that sort of thing to even happen. And so having a restriction like this makes sense. Long explanation for that. While interest rates did drop in early 2026, that did not last, and mortgage rates have recently ticked higher. I still think President Trump might take additional action to improve the housing market, especially before the midterm elections. However, at this time, the housing market seems poised to remain challenged and could face big declines. Many homeowners who bought property in the last couple of years now have negative equity as prices have started to soften. With all this in mind, let's take a closer look at housing. I don't even, first off, I don't think he really cares too much about the housing market from anybody but the perspective of like the big players in the market. But furthermore, it's too late now. I mean, the midterms are what, in like 8 months or something along those lines, right? It's 7 months. It's too late for him to have any serious impact, right? Everything that's going to be happening in 6, 7, 8 months from now in the housing market is all but locked in at this point. And so, I mean, maybe if you made some changes right this moment, it would be able to flesh out by that point. But for the most part, the housing market and its effects on the greater economy are in 6, 8 months from now are pretty much locked in because of how long these things take, right? It could take weeks to close on a house. It takes months to actually construct a house. And so the US is in the biggest housing bubble ever. I feel like people are complacent about the fact that the US housing market hit all-time highs in 2025, surpassing the levels of the 2006 housing bubble. Home prices surged shortly after the COVID pandemic due to the incredibly low interest rates that the Federal Reserve implemented to keep the economy from major declines. The Fed also kept interest rates low for a long time, which fueled inflation and asset price appreciation. Even though the Fed finally raised rates a couple of years ago, housing price appreciation momentum continued until very recently. As shown in the chart below, home prices hit unprecedented levels in 2025, suggesting we are in the biggest housing bubble ever. The chart also shows a slight pullback in home prices recently, the first sign of weakness in years. So I think there's a number of contributing factors to this, right? For one, we aren't really constructing as many homes as we used to, right? If you look at home construction rates over the last handful of years, over the last decade, compared to decades prior, we're building less despite obviously the population continuing to grow and being bigger than it ever has been. I think there's also, and that has to do with the consolidation of all these major construction firms, the lack of land hoarding, the lack of good land to build on, NIMBYism in general, people not wanting certain new types of constructions in their area, smaller towns at times having weird lot limits, like you need to have 1 to 5 acres minimum per house, which would obviously inherently limit the density of housing that you can build in a certain area. But I think it also shows that the economy, as far as like wage and employment goes, is not as good as it could be, right? And that sort of anecdotally aligns with what I'm seeing, right? You see more over the last however many years, over the last 10, 20 years, you've seen a ton of well-paying jobs. This even goes back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, when so much manufacturing moved overseas, right? Those were previously at times, lower middle class income type jobs are now moved overseas to manufacturing plants in China and Bangladesh and India. But then you also see, in the 90s, early 2000s, you've seen this, and through the 2010s, you've seen the same thing for more higher paying technical jobs like, software development, call centers. These kind of things have very consistently and in a very high rate have been outsourced to places like India, China, Bangladesh, and so to Mexico. And so in my understanding is that most of those jobs are being replaced with service level positions that are inherently going to be low income, lower class, type of positions. And so this aligns correctly with that sort of trend over time, right? Eventually that trend manifests, and it's going to manifest as there being less people with the ability to buy homes. There's going to be less people that have an income level that would justify a mortgage on a $300,000 home or whatever, right? And so part of what, and this sort of feeds into the next point that I'm going to make about how my understanding is that the starter level homes are produced much, much less than they used to be. My understanding is that somewhere around 40%-ish of homes, starter level homes are typically homes that are around the 1,400 square foot mark or less. And my understanding was prior to like COVID or prior to 2000 or in between the years of like 1950 and like 2000, I believe, somewhere in that ballpark, somewhere around the 40 percentage of homes were these smaller starter homes, right? That were produced. Well, my understanding now is that of all the homes produced in 2020 since the pandemic, really, only about 9% of homes being produced now are at that 1,400 foot or lower square foot threshold. Meaning, what does that mean? Well, that means that these big home construction firms are catering towards their upper clientele much more than the lower clientele. That they're building more 3,000 square foot luxury homes, multi-story and whatnot, than these smaller starter homes, right? And that has some connection to the land restrictions and yada yada and some of these other things. But I think it's more indicative of the state of the economy with regards to employment and income and whatnot. How there are just basically the middle class has shrunk over time. That there are less of these well-paying jobs that people can do. More people are stuck in sort of entry-level, low-paying, low-income type positions. So yeah, look at this chart. This chart is actually super scary, right? I think it's a little bit cut off by the top of the screen, but you can see, look at this 2006 bubble, right? I mean, that was the right before the 2008 crash, right? And it's directly connected to the 2008 crash, right? That is the 2008 crash, this line going straight down, right? Well, basically every time throughout history that you see a big jump up, you see a big jump down, right? And that's sort of inherent to capitalism. That's the boom bust cycle or whatever. But for all of these reasons presented, for all of the economic conditions, right, you see a humongous jump in 2006, right, and then a huge crash all the way into 2008, right? Well, you're seeing the same thing, but to an extent that we've never seen before, right? And this is inflation adjusted. So, your gut reaction may be, oh, well, there's $100 doesn't mean as much now as it used to mean 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. But this is inflation adjusted. This entirely accounts for that, right? This is an index. So this is super alarming, right? This, to me, either means one of two things. This means that we are headed in inevitable crash. And you can see historically, right, some of these time periods, you see a bit of a wiggle. Here, you see a bit of a wiggle and then it goes down. You see some wiggling. So it's not uncommon for there to be maybe some period of stagnation, right? If we were to extend this orange line out a bit, maybe it wiggles up here for a bit and then kind of goes down a bit, up a bit, and then, but it seems almost inevitable to me that we're going to see some sort of major crash. However, there's also, I think, another possibility, and that maybe we are in a new type of economy. Right. And what I mean by that is the United States economy has been shifting towards a service-based economy for a long time. That's why we were particularly hard hit by COVID, is because by the time 2020 rolled around, the U.S., so many of those high-paying jobs that I mentioned had been outsourced. So much manufacturing has been outsourced. They've been replaced with service-level jobs. The U.S. economy has become much more of a service type of economy. Well, who are most services geared towards, in theory, right? Well, the wealthier people, typically, right? Not completely, not totally, but in the aggregate, wealthy people have the capacity to do services much more so than lower income or middle income people. And so, this has a direct connection to the K-shaped economy thing, right? The only reason that the economy hasn't entered some major recession over the last however many years is because, despite the bottom 80% feeling the squeeze more and more than ever with the cost of living crisis, with rental and the cost of rent increasing at a higher pace than wage increases, with the cost of food increasing at a higher rate than wage increases, that the spending of the top 20% is basically propping all of that up. It's the lower part of the K-shaped economy, and that their spending is just increased at a rate that has matched the squeeze and reduction that the 80% has felt. So I worry that we're entering sort of this is a bit hyperbolic, but that we're entering a sort of a new Gilded Age in the United States. That the United States will increasingly become an economy of the uber giga wealthy, and then everybody else who serves them, right? You can almost think of it in sort of a feudalism fiefdom type of thing, right? You have a handful of kings, you have the lords, You have the nobility, right? And then you have everybody else who serves them, right? And you can even throw in the armies as the and the military as the sort of the knights in this equation, right? So I feel like we're sort of regressing in that kind of way. I'm not in favor of a total equality of outcome type of system, right? You need to have some stratification between jobs and the amount of utility that people provide to society to incentivize people to work harder, to study harder, to do these kind of things, right? Somebody who's working 5 hours a week, as an artist, maybe shouldn't have the same access to everything in quality of life. That's somebody who's working 50 hours a week as a doctor in an ER or something, right? One's obviously providing much more utility to society and therefore should be rewarded in some kind of way. And you should see that fleshed out in outcomes, right? In their access to the types of homes that they live in, to the types of food that they're able to eat, the amount of vacations that they're able to take, right? That makes sense to me. But you don't want to have that be completely unrestricted, right? Because then you reach a point that we're beginning to reach now where you have almost trillionaires, right? Isn't Elon Musk or some of these other giga 100 billionaires sort of getting close to a trillionaire, right? It is totally conceivable that within the next couple of decades, we're going to see our first trillionaire, right? The idea then in the United States, you can have such a huge stratification, right? The wealthiest country in the history of the world, you're going to have trillionaires, right? An amount of money that is actually inconceivable to the human mind, and far more money than anybody could ever reasonably use, and also provides far too much power, far more power than anybody in a non-elected position should possibly have. At the same time, you have people starving or not able to pay their bills or not able to, they're having to have their electricity shut off for a few days because they were short on their bill or whatever, despite working 40 hours a week and providing utility to the society in that sort of way, right? That means that stratification has gotten way out of hand, okay? And there needs to be stratification. You don't want a complete equality of outcome, but you want it to be limited, right? It can't just be forever. There has to be some upper and lower bounds, some limits. Got a bit off topic, a little bit of a tangent there, but that is what it is. Home affordability is at extremely low levels. So yeah, that's exactly what this is demonstrating. This is demonstrating that home prices are hilariously high right now, basically. One thing I'll say before I jump into this is that I feel like something that may cause this to stagnate much more than the 2006, 2008 crash is the types of people that are owning homes now compared to back in 2008, right? In 2008, the subprime mortgage loan crisis or whatever, part of what contributed, I think, to the lack of a stagnation period around the top of this graph, is that so many of these people should never have been allowed to get these loans in the first place, right? That they were basically allowing people to buy homes, to sign up for mortgages that were far outside the bounds of what their income should be allowing, and then they were rating they were bundling these all together and rating them as AAA, rating them as super super secure, despite the fact that a vast majority of these people aren't in well-paying enough jobs to justify the expense of their homes. And so that's why you saw so many foreclosures so quick in the 2006 2008 bubble. But for 2025, my understanding is that, at least I would think, that some of the banks learned a little bit of a lesson from all of that. I mean, I know a lot of them got bailed out, but they had to pay interest rates on a lot of those bailout loans. So it probably was overall a net bad thing for them. Alongside, I believe there was one or two major banks that basically straight up went bankrupt and closed. And so in theory, they should have learned something from that. And so therefore, I would think that there are going to be a smaller portion of people have these mortgages, that have these homes, that shouldn't be having them based on their income and wage levels and whatnot. And so maybe we're going to see basically there's these people that currently own these homes that are overpriced can hold out a bit longer than the majority of people during the subprime mortgage crisis could, because they're owned by wealthier people. In theory. So maybe that's an explanation of why it might stagnate a bit more in this example. But that doesn't, my thoughts would be, unless they are owned by unless the wealth of the people owning these homes is so great that they don't have to work at all and they're never ever going to have to sell their homes and they can just sit on it for eternity because they refuse to sell it at the same price or at a loss from what they took it at, then eventually this is going to have to trend down. And once it starts to trend down, it like really starts to trend down because people start to get afraid, right? The house down the street starts to sell for $50,000 less than it was listed for. You start to get worried because, oh wait, I've got my home listed at this. They just sold it for $50,000. Who knows? The other street the home down the street might be $75,000 less, and then the other home down the street might be $100,000 less. I'm going to sell now before this gets even worse, right? They want to be on the upper part of this crash before it reaches all the way. They want to be closer to the peak before it reaches the trough, and so that's, it could kind of be a spiraling building effect. Home affordability is at extremely low levels. With home values extremely elevated, home affordability has become a big issue for many potential home buyers. As shown below, the Home Affordability Index measures whether a family earning the median income could qualify for a mortgage on a median-priced home. When the index has a value of 100, it means that a value has 100% of the income needed to afford a mortgage on a median-priced home. When the index is at 140, as it was in 2020, it means that homes are very affordable and potential home buyers have 140% of the income required to buy a median-priced house. However, the current index is around 80, meaning a home buyer currently only has about 80% of the income required to buy a median-priced home. This means something has to give. Either home prices need to drop, or incomes need to rise significantly, or mortgage rates need to decline. It could also be a combination of these things. So yeah, this is what it's talking about, this little chart right here. So yeah, this makes sense, right? So if you look at the line, right, here's the 2008 financial crisis, right? Well, if you go back a couple of years to 2006, which is this trough right here, this trough directly aligns with this peak over here in the 2006 bubble in this other graph, right? Which makes sense, right? Because these graphs are sort of saying the same thing, right? This is an indexed graph of how expensive homes are right now, inflation adjusted. This is a graph showing how affordable they are in relation to people's income. And so it makes sense, right? We're at a trough here, and look, you can see that we're entering quite a big trough here. Now, the same point I made about the stagnation period in the trough applies over here. So because in theory, some less people who shouldn't, if the banks did learn some lessons and there's less subprime mortgages being signed by people who can't afford them really, then we'll see a longer stagnation period down here in this trough before it shoots back up. And also it's concerning because the trough is even lower, right? At the same time, and it aligns perfectly with this graph too, right? You see the peak is higher here in the 2025 bubble, and it's inflation adjusted, so you can't say that this is an inflation problem, than the 2006 peak, right? Well, the trough here is even lower for the 2006 peak trough, as in the 2025 trough is even lower, right? And I think this graph only goes to 2024, right? So if this is correct, no, it looks like there's some stagnation around the 2024-2025 period. So I don't know if this would continue to trend downwards, maybe a tiny bit, but I think it's mostly going to stagnate at this level, at least for the foreseeable future. But this is a bubble that almost has to pop at some point, right? Because you can't have homes always be at 80% or less of people's income threshold, right? You can't have homes be at an indexed 300 out of the 100. What's the index median, like 155 or something like that, right? You can't have that last forever, right? I mean, what does this do in effect, right? This drives people to rental properties more, which if more and more people are going to rental properties and there aren't as many rental properties being produced as is necessary, which is my understanding, then rental prices are going to continue to rise, which is already the biggest cost burden of people right now. I think in what I covered in last episode I released a few days ago or whatever, is that people are more cost burdened than they ever have been with rental prices, with the cost of living, which rental prices is one of the biggest, if not the biggest contributor to cost of living overall. And so mortgage rates could stay at relatively high levels or even go higher. Mortgage rates declined a bit a few weeks ago. However, they have been rising again more recently. The current rate for a 30-year mortgage is around 6.1%. Inflation remains a threat, especially as energy prices have been rising recently. In addition, with the U.S. national debt load at unprecedented levels, bond investors are demanding higher yields. All of this suggests that mortgage rates might not have much room to go down. And if inflation reignites, rates could even rise from here. The Mortgage Bankers Association expects that mortgage rates will remain high, and their economists see mortgage rates staying above 6% through 2026. All of this means that mortgage rates probably won't be going down enough to boost the housing market. Going back to what it's saying before, right? This means something has to give. Either home prices need to drop, or incomes needs to rise significantly, or mortgage rates need to decline, right? Well, it's already established in that paragraph there that mortgage rates very likely aren't going to decline for a couple of complicated reasons. It's also unlikely that incomes are going to rise significantly because the labor supply is the same as it has been. It's not like the labor supply is going down, right? You have the same number of people competing over the same number of jobs. On top of the fact that, you only see increasing outsourcing, right? You've had so many jobs outsourced over the last 10, 20 years. And those jobs have essentially been converted into low-paying service-level jobs. And so the idea that incomes are going to rise significantly is very, very unlikely. I don't really see the mechanism by which that would work. And so the only way that this is going to happen, the only give that there is for home prices to drop, right? And if home prices drop significantly, like they did in 2006 and looking like they're going to do in 2025, that is the definition of a recession because of what I said before, because so much of the economy is tied up in home prices that whenever you see this line go way down, that is a recession. That has so many knock-on effects to the economy in general that it is basically definitionally the recession. Major housing market warning signs. Home prices appear to have already peaked and may now be at unsustainable levels. I see multiple warning signs suggesting home prices could be ripe for a major correction. Yeah, major correction is the nice economist way of saying a recession, because that's what it's going to cause. Here are some additional major potential red flags for investors to consider, since home price declines could lead to a recession or exacerbate a recession. They will lead to a recession. If you see a small dip, if you look at all these smaller dips, right, each of these is an individually leading to a recession. But the big rise on this graph, dip on this graph, these do lead to a recession. I don't really see a mechanism by which you could see a big drop like this, like you see in the 2008 financial crisis, and have that not lead to a recession. I don't know what screwery you could do economics wise to make that not be the case, right? And I feel like this all harkens back to people's misconceptions about the economy, right? The economy is not like the stock market. It's not money flows. It's not money markets. It's not capital. What the economy is production. It's resource distribution. The economy is actually sort of a vague term that isn't super well defined, and people sort of selectively use different definitions of it. But the economy is everything. It's people's access to food, access to housing, the prices of these things in relation to their incomes, food. It's all of these things, medical care and how much it costs and how much of its income it costs and how accessible it is. All of these things are the economy, right? And to improve the economy, you want to improve production. You want to improve people's access. You want to improve the quality of the production. You want to improve all these things, right? That's why just pumping more money into the system, but not actually increasing production or anything like that, or people's access, doesn't really improve the economy, right? And this is exactly why using a real GDP calculation instead of the nominal GDP calculation is super important, right? Because the nominal GDP calculation can be misleading. You can have a nominal GDP increasing, but that can be totally due to inflation, greedflation, shrinkflation, companies raising their prices, increasing profit margins, at the same time that the same number of goods is being produced. The same number and same quality of goods is being produced and distributed to the public. Number one, the number of homeowners with negative equity surged by about 60% in 2025, and now over 1 million homeowners have negative equity. This is a big concern because when people have no equity, it is a lot easier to walk away if there's an economic downturn. This could create a wave of foreclosures. So, what does this mean? Well, home equity can sort of very surface level, very simplistically be thought of as the price of your home increasing, right? In reality, when it's talking about is actually the relationship between your home's value and the remaining balance on your mortgage, which can be influenced by a number of other factors and whatnot. But if you want to think about it as increasing home equity as your home rising in value and negative equity as your home decreasing in value, you can do that. But in this specific case, right, you can see that home values have continued to rise. Actually, they've been mostly stagnant, it seems, since 2001-ish. And so that's partly why you see homeowners with negative equity, is because that either means that they aren't paying off their mortgage or they're borrowing against their mortgage, or their home value is not increasing, right? It's either staying stagnant or it's going down. And in this case, it's a combination of all of these things, at least to some degree, obviously in different percentages and different ratios and whatnot. This is a big concern because when people have no equity, it is a lot easier to walk away if there is an economic downturn. This could create a wave of foreclosures. Basically, what this is saying is that if you can't afford your home, if the home has become too much of a burden financially on you, it becomes much easier to, and much more intelligent and much smarter to sign it away, to sell it to somebody else, than to continue to try and make home payments that you have no ability to do so. Foreclosures are surging across the United States, and this is happening at a time when the economy is relatively strong. This makes me wonder how much more foreclosures could rise if the economy enters a recession. This could create a tidal wave of foreclosures. So I don't really like how this author phrases this. He says, and this is happening at the same time when the economy is relatively strong. Well, no, kind of hearkening back to what I just said about what the economy means and the sort of the selective use of the word economy. The economy is sort of everything about society. It is the accessibility of homes, the accessibility of rent, how much of your rent is being paid to income, or how much of your how much of your income is being paid to rent, how much of your income is being paid to food, to medical bills, how accessible these things are, the quality of these things. All of these things make up what is the economy. And so when he says the economy is relatively strong, I'm assuming he means like the stock market, right? And things like that, right? And so saying that the stock market is doing fine, at the same time foreclosures are surging, aligns with the increasing wealth and wage and inequality that we see in the United States, and the lack of, and the stratification, right? And you see a slight increase in the number of super high paying jobs. The number of people who are millionaires and billionaires continues to increase at the same time that the middle class shrinks, and the number of people in those low income, low wage type positions increases, right? So this makes sense, right? You see more and more people being squeezed out, unable to afford their homes, being foreclosed on, at the same time that it appears that the stock market is doing fine and the billionaires and millionaires are continuing to make money hand over fist. I don't know if it's doing that good, right? To say that the economy is relatively strong, my understanding of the stock market has been a little bit up and down over the last however many years. This makes me wonder how much more foreclosures could rise if the economy enters a recession. This could create a tidal wave of foreclosures. Yes, that would be my reaction as well, is that if you're seeing foreclosures surge while the economy, the stock market, and some of these more traditional metrics, nominal GDP, are doing well, that's a bad sign, because that means that, if you do enter a proper recession, that will cause a number of these sort of more middle income, lower upper income type people need to sell their homes. You're going to, potentially be foreclosed on. This could really amp it up big time, right? That's not good that you're seeing foreclosures surging at the same time that the stock market is doing good, right? That is not a sign of an economy that makes sense. That is the sign of a house of cards economy that's just ripe to be knocked over. In yet another sign of distress with homeowners, Google searches for help with mortgage have recently reached levels that were last seen during the Great Financial Crisis, or GFC, of 2006-2008. So yeah, that makes sense to me. AI-related layoffs have been surging and could accelerate in the coming years. The job market is showing signs of weakness, and if this doesn't improve soon, it could put many homeowners in jeopardy and at risk of foreclosure. I didn't even think about this. Yeah, talking about the outsourcing of manufacturing that happened sort of more middle of the 20th century, end of the 20th century. You talk about the outsourcing of more technical, higher skilled jobs that you saw in the late 90s and in the 2000s and the 2010s, right? This could very well be, the proliferation of AI, in say truck drivers, right? You see automated trucks were just over the last couple of years allowed to be used in Texas, right? And so you're going to see, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that used to be working for driving trucks all day, and that would be a lower middle income type job, a lower middle class type position, are then suddenly going to be put out of the job. And those aren't going to be replaced with middle or high income positions. Those are going to be further replaced with low income service type positions serving those top 20%. And so, yeah, I didn't even think about the AI related effects on the employment and wage and income markets. That's actually makes a ton of sense to me. I question how applicable AI can be to a lot of these types of positions, but for something like truck driving, I mean, it seems pretty clear that that is the future, that eventually these trucking companies are going to want to replace all of their actual drivers that they need to pay with automated trucks if possible, especially as the price of doing so continues to go down and down. And so, yeah, that could be another catalyst to help. That's why I've been saying, right? Oh, we have a conflation of a whole bunch of different complex things that all could be contributing to a big recession, like bigger than we've seen in our lifetimes, right? Maybe even something closer to like the Great Depression. Because you have this confluence, you have this grouping of these complex things all coming together at the exact same time. And many of these things, I don't know how you fix. I don't know how you prevent them from eventually hitting the wall. Unless we just live unless the economy just doesn't make sense anymore, unless all traditional economic metrics don't apply anymore, maybe because of the internet or I don't know. That to me, it doesn't seem like a super compelling argument, but maybe the economy just works different nowadays than it does back prior to 2000, and than did for hundreds of years. I don't know. Who knows? Where I could be wrong. It's possible that the new Federal Reserve chair will lower rates more than investors currently expect when Jerome Powell is replaced in May. This could greatly improve affordability and prevent the housing market from reaching a worst-case scenario. President Trump could become more focused on housing affordability and on boosting the economy in general, especially just before the midterm elections. Oil prices have been surging due to the war in Iran, and this has raised inflation concerns, which has helped push interest rates higher. But if a ceasefire is announced and oil prices drop, this could allow rates to begin easing again. So I think if anything could kick off the actual recession to maybe turn a small recession into the turbo downward spiral, it's going to be the replacement of Jerome Powell with some sycophant, right? With somebody who's just going to do what Trump wants, not going to do what is best for the economy or using traditional economic analysis, right? My understanding is that Jerome Powell is not just a sycophant to Trump, even though he was appointed by Trump, that he's for the most part been doing a good job and was a huge reason for the U.S. The U.S.'s relativistic good recovery after the acute effects of the pandemic in 2020, 2021, 2022, right? In the following years, we recovered better than almost every other developed nation in the entire world. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think part of the reason, at least, is because of Jerome Powell holding firm and heading the Fed and being the chair of the Fed, doing a relatively decent job at it. But I've already done a lot of analysis on this, so I'm not going to continue. Maybe I'll do a deeper dive on this when this time gets a little bit closer. But replacing him with some sycophant, which is exactly what Trump would do, because that's all he does, right? He only cares about loyalty to him and what he wants to do personally. Trump is not a smarter economic analyst than Jerome Powell, right? If you put Trump at the head of the chair of the Fed, he would certainly do a worse job than Jerome Powell was, right? And so I wonder if his replacement Also, markets know. Markets aren't completely stupid, and so markets will notice his replacement in May, and I wonder if his replacement will be the official start of the recession. Who knows? That seems like it aligns so well to me if that was the case. My chakras are aligned with that one. My third eye sees it. In summary, with home prices potentially declining due to a lack of affordability, many homeowners could be at risk of having negative equity. This suggests the housing market could be poised for a downward spiral, with rising layoffs likely to create another wave of what is already a surge in foreclosures. There appears to be a real chance of a growing negative feedback loop for the housing prices, whereby each negative input just exacerbates other negative factors, right? I think that's an interesting technical way of putting this sort of idea that I've been presenting, that like the economy is in a bad state. It's in a house of cards type of state, right? With no easy one fix. Once a downward spiral gets started, it can be very hard to stop it. If these concerns grow, it could also spook potential home buyers, since they might decide to wait for further price declines. I believe a home price correction is increasingly likely, and declines could accelerate in the next economic downturn. All right, I was going to read this whole new other article called Pending Home Sales Fall to Record Low in February, Housing Demand Breaking Down. But this is sort of just more support for the article I just read talking about the home bubble situation. This graph is also very concerning, saying U.S. Pending home sales are at an all-time low. This is just sort of a more monthly update. This article is talking about the results we've seen in February. But yeah, here's another graph saying pending home sales hit lowest level in history. Now this is talking about how we've seen a slight increase, right? It says down here the monthly increase, right, from 70.8 to 72.1. This tiny increase, right? But we're still well below the normal sales level. And so, yeah, you see this huge divergence between the mortgage rates and the real home prices. You've seen this divergence right here, right? And in this section right here around the 2006-2008 point, you see this big divergence, right? Well, we're seeing another big divergence here again. My understanding is that mortgage rates have continued to stabilize, but the real home prices have risen a bit. And so that we see a huge delta here. Which is not a good sign. I don't think it's not looking good. It would not blow my mind at all if within the next quarter, in the next 2 quarters, Q2, Q3, Q4, 2026, and specifically maybe when Jerome Powell is replaced with some sycophant in May, and whatever weird nonsensical changes that person makes. That could lead to this huge drop that could lead to the next recession. We'll see. Only time will tell, baby. Hopefully not. I don't want people to lose their jobs, to lose their homes, to be destitute on the street. But the markets don't care, right? The markets are a bit like the economy is a bit like physics, or every action is going to have an equal or opposite reaction. And so, you can only stave off the inevitable so long with financial trickery and screwery and economic nonsense.